I dealt with all kinds of people when I worked at a truck stop gas station outside of Houston, Texas. Most were fine, and by fine, I mean unmemorable. But the later in the day it got, the weirder people got, which is why I hated the overnight shift. But it paid better, so I'd occasionally volunteer to pick up a few shifts when money was tight. But one trucker I'll never forget. It was just past 1 a.m. in late July, about a quarter of the way through my shift, when things had quieted down and I settled in behind the counter with my phone to watch Netflix. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, which cast a harsh glow over the racks of chips and soda, but otherwise the night was slow. I was getting really into the movie I'd put on when the bell above the door jingled, and I turned to see a large man walk in. He had a hulking frame, a greasy trucker cap pulled low over his eyes, and he looked right at me and blew me a kiss. I remember feeling pissed and rolling my eyes, but before I could look away, I saw who he was with. Trailing behind him was a young woman, no older than 20, with wide, frightened eyes. She was wearing a faded white t-shirt, had a bruised cheek, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. The trucker grunted a laugh at me, his voice rough and gravelly, as he headed towards the coffee machine. The woman glanced at me, her eyes pleading for help, but before I had a chance to think, the guy barked at her to stay close. Something about the whole situation felt sinister. Deep down, I knew she was in trouble, but I didn't know what to say to her. I was no bigger than her, and I was working alone. I watched them from behind the counter, my gut twisting uneasily. The guy paid for his coffee and a bag of chips, and I'll never forget what came next. He leaned in towards me to get his change, holding and pinching my finger as he grabbed his change.
You want a party?
I yanked my hand away and said I was working. It was all I could think of to say.
Okay, next time.
He laughed and gripped the woman's arm tightly as they left. I could see the desperation in her eyes as she glanced back at me one last time. Moments later, as I stood watching from the counter, I saw a flash of movement as the woman ran into the woods behind the station. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her disappear into the trees, knowing she'd be running straight into a muddy ditch at the grass line. The trucker burst out of his rig, banging his fist against the truck's grill, and sprinted after her. Within moments, he had caught up to her and was dragging her back towards the truck. Her legs were muddy, and she struggled and screamed. The sound didn't carry into the store, but I could see the desperation in her face under the bright parking lot lights. He threw her into the cab and sped off, the tires kicking up dust as he roared back onto the highway. Shaking, I grabbed the phone and called the police, my voice trembling as I told them what I had just seen. The dispatcher on the other end asked for a description, but in my panic, I had only seen the truck was blue with a white unmarked trailer. I hadn't seen the license plate either. When the police arrived, they took my statement, but without more information, there was little they could do. Trucks like the one I described were a dime a dozen on this stretch of highway. I felt a crushing sense of guilt and helplessness, knowing that I might have been her only chance for escape. I kept thinking about what he'd said to me, and if he had been alone that night, he might have done more than ask me to go with him. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night haunted me. Every time a truck pulled into that station, I found myself scanning the driver's face, dreading seeing that guy again. I hope that woman is okay. But somehow I know something awful happened to her, and it sickens me to think that I might have been the last person to see her alive. The Florida sun had long since dipped below the horizon by the time I finished my shift. The humidity clung to me as I packed up my gear and tools and headed down the newly leveled path, past the bulldozers through the woods. The path stretched out in front of me, a path that would soon become a road into another new development. Before I hiked the empty straight line of dirt cutting through the dense trees, I stopped to take a leak and fell behind the rest of my crew. It was a Friday, and we were all ready for the weekend. It was supposed to be a quick hike back to the main road where we had all parked, but that night, it felt like anything but. As I walked, an eerie feeling crept over me, like I was being watched, and I walked faster, shrugging it off, blaming it on the fatigue of a long day and the oppressive heat. But the further I went, the stronger the feeling grew. The rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal animals in the woods didn't help, and I was sure someone was watching me. I turned around at the empty path behind me and saw nothing but the bare strip of dirt cut between the trees. I turned back with my skin crawling. I needed to get out of there. I finally reached the now empty space along the edge of the woods where we'd met that morning. I was relieved to get inside my car and turn the key, but the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it was no use. The car wouldn't start. I cursed under my breath, pulling out my phone to call for a tow. The operator assured me a truck would be there within the hour, so I settled back into my seat to wait. For some reason, out here in the middle of nowhere, I locked the doors. Darkness fell quickly, and the swampy woods beside me looked black and impenetrable. The only light came from the pale moon overhead, making creepy shadows outside the car. As I sat there in the heat, I saw something shift in the woods. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but then I saw them clearly. Dark shapes, like people, but somehow not. They moved soundlessly, weaving through the trees. Their movements were slow and deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the shapes remained misty, like shadows come to life. I rolled up the windows and frantically dialed the tow company again. My hands were trembling at this point. They reassured me the truck was on the way, but they couldn't get there soon enough. The seconds felt like hours as I watched the shapes drift closer, their dark forms blending into the night. My heart pounded, and I clutched the steering wheel with my sweaty hands, holding my breath. I didn't know if they were aware of me, but I was terrified of making any sound that might bring them closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the headlights of the tow truck pierced the darkness, bathing the forest in harsh light. The figures vanished instantly, swallowed up behind the trees. I stumbled out of the car, waving my arms to get the driver's attention. He pulled up beside me, and I practically threw myself into the truck. "Everything all right, buddy?" the driver asked, eyeing me with concern. I lied to him with a shaking voice. "Yeah, I just had a long day." I watched the woods as he hooked up my car and pulled it onto the tow, but everything was now still and silent, as if nothing had ever been there. As we pulled away, the taillights painting the woods red, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something in those woods that we shouldn't have. I wondered what would have happened if the tow truck's headlights hadn't dispelled the shadows. I never believed in paranormal stuff before that night, but now I'm not so sure what might be out there in those long stretches of dark, wooded places we drive past every day. What's watching us from the shadows as we live in the light, unaware? If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.